Susan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank the Francis Bacon Society for the opportunity to make this presentation to you today. So my talk is called Mercy Seasons Justice, Equity and Eating in the Merchant of Venice. And I'd like to let's start with some Shakespeare, shall we? I'd like to start by reading out one of the finest speeches in the entire Shakespeare canon. It's Portia's speech from the famous trial scene in The Merchant of Venice. So let's start there, shall we? And this is from the first folio, so you can read along with the Elizabethan script. The quality of mercy is not strained. It drops as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His sceptre shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. An earthly power does then show like God's when mercy seasons justice. Well, what a superb speech that is. So I've been interested in Merchant of Venice now for quite a number of years. The play fascinates me. But only recently I discovered something about the play that I had never known before. I learned to my amazement that there's a moment in Francis Bacon's professional life where he actually appears to quote from The Merchant of Venice. And this claim is made in this book here, a really remarkable book, Law versus Equity in The Merchant of Venice by Mark Edwin Andrews. This is a book I wasn't aware of until relatively recently, and I do want to thank another Baconian, Christina Waldman, who lives in New York, who made me aware of this book and actually sent me a copy, which is a very rare copy. It's not an easy book to find. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit about this book this afternoon. This book hasn't really had much impact in the Shakespeare authorship sphere, but it has had quite a lot of discussion in a subdiscipline of legal academic studies. Shakespeare and the law is an entire subdiscipline. And this book has caused quite a stir in certain circles. The author puts forward the view that The Merchant of Venice, the play, actually influenced what was one of the biggest legal conflicts of the Elizabethan time, which was the jurisdiction between the common law and equity. And furthermore, Mark Edwin Andrews also makes the claim that Francis Bacon, who played a very key role in this legal conflict, actually quotes from the play, from this very speech of Portia, in the very legal opinion that he gives, which resolves this age-old question, the conflict between common law and equity. Now, I was amazed to hear this, and I'd never come across this. And in fact, when I racked my brains, I don't think I can think of another occasion where Francis Bacon is actually found quoting one of the Shakespeare plays. Now, by this I don't mean just using the same words or a same formula of words. I'm not talking about a parallel here. I'm actually talking about the next step. I'm talking about Francis actually quoting from the play, intending to quote from the play in the context of the play and its message. And I'll just read you out what he says. And this occurs in 1616. Just need to find it. Here we go. So in 1616, this legal debate comes to a head. I'm going to talk about that in a little while. But Francis he's asked by King James to provide an opinion. An opinion actually carries the day and resolves the question in favour of equity law. And here is the covering letter, the beginning of the covering letter that Francis sends. Now, forasmuch as mercy and justice be the true supports of our royal throne, and that it properly belongs to us in our princely office to take care and provide for our subjects, etc., etc. So here we have Francis referring to mercy and tying it with the supports of the royal throne, which is exactly what Portia is talking about here. So was Francis actually referring to the play? If he was, that's rather fascinating, because the baseline here is that Francis Bacon and Shakespeare had nothing to do with each other whatsoever. We're told that Francis Bacon never refers to Shakespeare and that Shakespeare never refers to Francis Bacon. On the face of it, on the historical face of it, they didn't even know each other, which is really remarkable because they spent the same period of time, 25, 30 years, both living at the same time here in London, which at the time was a town of about 250,000 people, about the size of Swindon. So essentially we had two of the greatest geniuses of the English language of all time living cheek by jowl for 25 years in Swindon and never crossing paths. So did Francis Bacon and Shakespeare have anything to do with each other? Well, if Francis Bacon is quoting one of the plays, it would seem that he was familiar with the works. Now, this is Barry's new book, wonderful book. It's had one rather unfortunate review, which I think is a very unfair and terrible review in the Daily Telegraph. The reason I bring it up, though, is to cite the very last line of the review which appeared a couple of weeks ago. It's a rather remarkable line. The reviewer, who had already decided that Bacon has nothing at all to do with Shakespeare, ends the review with this line. He says, "I think that there is probably more bacon in a kosher kitchen than in all of Shakespeare." Now that's a very interesting line for two reasons. First of all, because obviously he's saying that in his opinion there is no bacon at all in Shakespeare. But there's an irony and a twist to what he said, which we're going to come back to. But against that benchmark, that there's no connection between Bacon and Shakespeare, here we have the suggestion that Bacon was actually quoting and referring to a play. So there's some tension and some anxiety there that we're going to explore a little bit this afternoon. But first of all, I want to pivot now and bring in a completely different topic from out of left field. I don't know how many of you may remember when the 400th anniversary of the death of William Shakespeare a few years ago in 2016, there was an absolutely wonderful night of entertainment provided from Stratford-upon-Avon. Did anyone remember seeing that? There was plays, there was excerpts, there was music, there was all kinds of things. It was absolutely wonderful. Well, in the middle of that, Sir Ian McKellen presented a speech. And it's a speech from a very interesting play called The Book of Sir Thomas More. He presented this and it was quite controversial. And the reason it's controversial was twofold. Firstly, because it's not actually strictly part of the Shakespeare canon. We'll get to that in a second. But secondly, because it's quite a controversial speech in which he talks about the rights of foreigners, the rights of strangers, the rights of refugees. And obviously it was a politically apposite speech to give, and as you can see at the time there was quite some press about the fact that Sir Ian had used this occasion to make a speech about refugees and foreigners at quite a critical moment. Now this is an absolutely fascinating play, this Book of Sir Thomas More. It was never performed and it was never published, but it has survived. The manuscript of the play has survived, and it's one of the very few manuscripts from that era that has survived. And the manuscript reveals some incredible things about the way plays were put together in those days. First of all, the manuscript is in several hands. The main hand is a guy called Anthony Mundi, but there are other hands that contribute to it, and 3 pages of the play are contributed by William Shakespeare. Scholars are in universal agreement with this, and they can tell that the 3 pages are by Shakespeare because he uses many metaphors, many words, many ideas which turn up in the plays elsewhere, to the extent that there's really no objection. These 3 pages are by the author William Shakespeare. And they describe a speech given by Sir Thomas More at the height of these riots which took place in 1517, the 1st of May, in London. And the Londoners were rioting because of the presence of foreigners in the city, foreign merchants who were driving the prices up. And Sir Thomas More delivers this wonderful speech, calming the people down and encouraging them to welcome the refugees and the people from other countries. So the speech, as I say, has many connections to Shakespeare, and also, amazingly enough, has many connections to Francis Bacon. Now these connections have even been noted in the official academic copy of the speech. In the footnotes you can find 3 or 4 references to items in this Sir Thomas More speech which turn up in Bacon's writings. This is extraordinary. One of them is the word adheres, which is used in a very unique way here, which is not used anywhere else that way, except in Francis Bacon's 1597 essay. He's credited here as being the first person to use that word in that context. There are others. There's one here that I really like. Now let me read this out from the Sir Thomas More. Again, he's talking to the refugees. "Let me set up before your thoughts, good friends, one supposition, which if you will mark, you shall perceive how horrible a shape your innovation bears. How horrible a shape your innovation bears." Now what's he saying there? An innovation in this sense is something new in time. And what Sir Thomas More is saying is, you've brought something forward new, these riots, and look how horrible they are. They're ugly, it's a riot, it's a terrible thing. Now, if you're familiar with Francis Bacon's essays, that thought will immediately leap out at you because it is literally the opening line of his essay on innovation. And let me read it to you. This is 1625. As the births of living creatures at first are all ill-shapen, so are all innovations, which are the births of time. So what Francis is saying there, and he goes on to develop, is that the right way to introduce change is slowly and imperceptibly as time and nature itself brings forward changes. But when we bring forward changes suddenly, for example, the sudden birth of a new creature, when things are suddenly brought forwards in time as an innovation, they are ill-shapen, misshapen, like a newborn infant. Now, that is such a specific idea, such a unique idea. It's not a commonplace at all. And here it is in Sir Thomas More, and here it is also in Francis Bacon. Now, this play was never published. It was written around the mid-1590s. So the author of this could not possibly have copied from Francis Bacon's essay, which didn't appear till 1627. But on the other hand, Francis Bacon could not have copied from this play because it was never published, and on the face of it, there was no way for him to have any access to it. So there are some very fascinating connections between these 3 pages of handwriting, and first of all, the works of Shakespeare, and secondly, with the works of Bacon. And this hasn't really been explored terribly much. And notice, we've got 3 pages of handwriting. 3 pages of handwriting. That's interesting, isn't it? We'll come back to that. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about Merchant of Venice. So when I became a Baconian, which was, it was 2001, I remember it well. A couple of years after I became a Baconian, I went to see The Merchant of Venice in a professional production for the first time. And I was fascinated by it. It really got me. It also left me with all kinds of queasy feelings. There's a lot of anxiety in the play. There's a lot of unanswered questions. There's a lot of things hovering over that play which aren't satisfied at the end. Now, one of the things that really got me going after I watched it was this whole business of the pound of flesh. And I'm sure you remember those of you that know the play. We have Antonio and Bassanio. Bassanio is in debt. He needs to borrow more money. He borrows it from Antonio. Antonio goes to the moneylender, Shylock. They enter an arrangement. In 3 months, he will borrow the money, repay it in 3 months. If he doesn't repay it, which he'll have no problem doing because his ships are full of cargo and they're going to be coming in soon. But if he doesn't repay it, he will give up a pound of the flesh of his body. And of course, the trial scene is the culmination of that. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Hopefully, you're broadly familiar with Merchant of Venice. But what really bugged me after watching that play was why Shylock wanted the pound of flesh. It didn't make any sense to me. It was really the thing that was driving the play, his desire for this pound of flesh. And over again, the characters ask him, why? Why do you want the pound of flesh, Shylock? It's strange, it's cruel, it makes no sense. Why do you want a pound of flesh? And every time he's asked, he deflects the question. He says, well, you don't need to know the answer to that. Whatever I want, I want. Some men, he says, don't like a gaping pig. People have their own likes and dislikes. I'm not going to tell you. Well, I racked my brains about this. I thought, well, there's got to be a reason. There's got to be something that's driving this. And I was already familiar with the fact that the characters of Antonio and Bassanio in the play quite uncannily reflect the situation of Francis Bacon and Anthony Bacon in those years, the 1590s, when this play was written. Francis was in debt. He was borrowing money from Antonio, his brother, Anthony, sorry. The names are the same. And Anthony would be going into debt to moneylenders and even standing bond for the money. So the situation between the brothers, Bacon, is exactly the same as the situation between the 2 characters in the play. Now, I want to make something very clear at this point before I go any further, in deference to Dr. Clarke, if I might say so in his book. I want to make it very clear that because we can see potentially the biographical details of Francis and Anthony in the play, that does not entitle us to conclude from that therefore Francis wrote the play. Not at all. Of course, somebody else could have written it and simply put those characters in it. Of course, it could be mistaken, and those characters don't refer to the historical personages as well. So I'm absolutely not concluding or even taking any comfort from the fact that these characters seem to portray Francis and Anthony, I'm not taking that to conclude that Francis wrote the play. But let me flip that round. If we can show by other means that Francis Bacon did write the play, then the association of these two characters with Francis and Anthony is unavoidable. It's impossible to imagine Francis writing the play, constructing these two characters and not being aware that they portray his circumstances. So, without further ado, one day this idea popped into my head. Well, goodness gracious, if he wants a pound of flesh, pardon me, I just blew the joke. If he wants a pound of flesh and these two characters are actually the brothers Bacon, then he wants the pound of flesh that he wants is a pound of bacon. Now, of course, he's Jewish. He's subject to the Jewish dietary, the kosher laws, and of course that's the one thing that Shylock cannot have, bacon. Now, when I first thought of that, well, I thought that's a funny, silly little thing, isn't it? That can't be real. That's a silly little thought that I'm just coming to. But then I started thinking about it and I thought, well, wait a second. Actually, this gives me an opportunity now to test the idea, because it is a really quite an appealing idea that the pound of flesh is the pound of bacon. It triggers all kinds of things. It triggers this idea of the taboo, the fact that really for all of us, whatever culture and race we are, the thing that we secretly want more than anything is the thing that is forbidden to us. And also this play is really demonstrating this interface, what happens when the Jew meets the Christian, or when two different cultures or faiths meet. And the point of intersection, the point of anxiety is exactly those things that define the cultures, those taboos, those rules, those restrictions, those cultural things that give our cultures meaning are the very site of anxiety when we encounter the other. So the more I started to think about this, I thought, well, you know, it's not a bad idea. So I started looking at the play and I realised that the play is full of references to dining, to eating, to pork, even to bacon. Now, in fact, the word bacon does not appear in the play. It's actually, this is the Sir Thomas More, there's a full. It doesn't appear, but there is this one extraordinary line in Merchant of Venice. This making of Christians will raise the price of hogs. If we grow all to be pork eaters, we shall not shortly have a rasher on the coals for money. Okay, so they're sitting around in the kitchen making their breakfast and they're opining that if Jews are going to keep converting to Christians, well, more people are going to be eating bacon and the price of bacon is going to go up. And this is just a little aside. So the word bacon is hovering over that, but look, he doesn't actually use the word bacon. The price of hogs, if we grow to be pork eaters, we shall not shortly have a rasher on the coals for money. Now, a rasher is only one thing. A rasher is a thin slice of bacon. So I started to think, well, you know, maybe this isn't such a silly joke. Maybe this is actually what's going on in the play. Now, this was back in the mid-2000s when I came to these realisations. But when I started looking into it, I discovered that academics have been writing about issues of eating and dining and pork in bacon and in this particular play over and over. And I'm just going to cite you one example. Here is a really tremendous paper, Failures of Eating in the Merchant of Venice by David B. Goldstein, 2012. So this was years after I came to this realisation. Now, if I may, I'm just going to read the preamble to this paper. The Merchant of Venice contains numerous references to meals. Yet strikingly, there is virtually no staged eating in the play. Food does not nourish, or it does so at such cost that it's hardly worth the trouble. Nevertheless, people eat as they must. Here, as elsewhere in Shakespeare, the body and its terrible appetites demand to be assuaged. The play is utterly permeated with eating, from the opening image of the wind cooling the broth of the sea, to the metaphor of manna raining from the proverbial skies of Portia's generosity. The whole world of this play is potentially edible, at once offered to some and withheld to others. Of course, this means that its characters are also potentially edible and therefore vulnerable. Shakespeare creates a work in which at issue is a pound of flesh, interchangeable with that of mutton, goat, pork, or another human. The Merchant of Venice is a play about the reduction of humanity to matter and about the potential for that matter to be consumed. It's about how eating unites and more frequently destroys us. So the more I thought about this, the more I realised that far from being a silly little joke, this idea of the pound of bacon, which remember is only available to you if the author of the play was portraying himself and his brother whose surname happened to be Bacon. If none of that's true, then none of this is available. But if that's true, then it becomes the master trope of the whole play and unlocks the architecture of the play to understand it. I mean, I could flip through, I could just about read this whole paper as the rest of my talk, but, the next page, he then talks about the fact that Shylock's very first words are he's invited to dinner, and he replies, yes, to smell pork, to eat of the... In other words, his very first words out of his mouth are talking about the fact that if he was to go to eat to dinner at the Christians, he would be eating pork, and that would be impossible because right there is the clash of cultures. So he talks here about why is it that the first thing we learn about Shylock, besides the fact that he practices usury, is that he doesn't eat pigs. And on this paper is... Pork also serves as a marker for more general problems, the problem of meals in the play. So I realised that this idea that the pound of flesh is a pound of bacon and that somehow that this is operating below the surface of the play to generate this anxiety about our fears of mutual consumption, our fears of eating each other up, our fears of being eaten by our enemy and in turn of reciprocating that. And it turns out that this is actually one of the key themes of the play. So now I want to pivot again and talk about this notion of equity and common law and Francis Bacon and see how this applies to the play. So Mark Edwin Andrews, let's go back to this book. Mark Edwin Andrews was a law student, and one day he was taking some extra courses in Shakespeare. He had this Shakespearean professor give a course on the Merchant of Venice. And at the end, the Shakespearean professor made a comment about Portia's plea, her speech. He said, "What did you think of that as a legal plea?" And he said, "It didn't sound like a legal plea to me, it sounded like an equitable plea." And the professor said, "Well, what did you mean?" And he said, "Well, in the late 1500s and early 1600s, this was the big legal dilemma of the day in Elizabethan England. There was really two separate, and I'm going to simplify a little bit, and please, I'm not a lawyer, so please don't take any legal action based on the advice I'm about to give this afternoon. But broadly speaking, there are two areas of law at that time. One is the common law. This is the law of judges and judgment and contracts and bonds, where you would, if you have entered into a contract with someone, something's gone wrong, you go there to have a decision made about the money and the property. But separately, another court system had developed, and it had really come, it's in the Chancery, and it's looked after by the Lord Chancellor, and this has been executed literally on behalf of the King. And in this court, this is the court of equity, in which fairness, mercy, is brought to the justice. So here's the way it would work. Someone would go to the court of the common pleas, the common law. They had a contract dispute with someone. A judgment would be handed down. But the person who was subject to the judgment wouldn't like that. So they would run across town to the court of equity, and they would put in a petition saying, well, look, this isn't fair, or it didn't take into account my personal circumstances, or look, I just can't deal with this. And the King, through the Lord Chancellor, through the Chancery Courts, would then make a decision based on equity, based on fairness. Now, the decisions from the Equity Court were called decrees. The decisions from the common law are called judgments. So Mark Edwin Andrews realised and looked and saw that this trial scene in Merchant of Venice actually portrays with great detail and with great nuance this dispute that was currently playing out in the courts of London at the time as to who had final jurisdiction. Because if the Chancellor then says, okay, well, yes, you were hardly done by, I issue a decree, the people in the common law court, you cannot actually proceed to collect the money. If you do, I put an injunction out, I will send you to jail. And so there was a stalemate between the two courts. So who had the right of way? Was it the common law or equity law? Now, this really built up in the 1590s, and Mark Edwin Andrews tells the reader that three people were the key people involved in this. One was Francis Bacon, one was Lord Ellesmere, the Lord Chancellor, and the other was Sir Edward Coke, Francis Bacon's great rival through the 1590s. Now, Coke was on the side of the common law, and Lord Ellesmere and Bacon were on the side of equity law. And this battle was raging in the 1590s. Lord Ellesmere, who'd just become the Lord Chancellor at that time, He had put forward a call in Parliament for the laws to be renewed and reinvigorated, for obsolete laws to be taken out, for laws to be harmonised. And Francis had got right behind this program in the 1590s to really take a clean broom to the law and renovate it. And this was one of the issues that was in the air, but in many ways it was the main issue. So Edwin Andrews does something very interesting in this book. He went away to the law library, he spent months looking into this, and then he decided to write this book, which only became published many, many years later. He had no intention of publishing it at the time. But what he did was he took the trial scene and he rewrote the trial scene as if it was taking place in London, in the Court of Common Law and in the Court of Equity. And when he did that, he realised that Shakespeare, the author, has taken meticulous care to use all the correct language, all the correct legal terminology, and all the correct legal niceties to make the trial scene a very precise description and display of exactly this common law versus equity issue as it was playing out in London. To the extent that the play even pivots, that the scene even pivots on one particular line. After the judgment, where judgment has been found for Shylock, yes, the bond is good, you may have your pound of flesh, the judgment is passed down. That represents the end of the Court of Common Pleas, the common law part of the scene, and literally it pivots on one line when Portia says, "Tarry a little." And then she introduces the whole notion of the drop of blood and this speech. And then, so the second half of the scene plays out as if it plays out in a court of equity in London. And what Mark and Edwin Andrews shows is that the language is precisely correct in the two halves of this scene, that Shakespeare never slips up. And he doesn't only get the big words right, but he gets the little words right. The legal terms that he's just using in passing are all absolutely correct. So if we just slip back to the paradigm that William Shakespeare, the actor, had written this, he had no legal training at all. He wasn't involved in the law at this time, and yet here we have this exquisite depiction of the common law versus equity issue at the time in the play. Now, subsequent to this, it turned out to be Francis Bacon's actual destiny in history to be the person to actually resolve this issue of equity. In 1615, there was a case where this came to a head. It was referred to the Lord Chancellor. The King then asked Francis Bacon to make a decision once and for all. And Francis Bacon and a group of others, but he was the head of the group, went back and looked through all the precedents of law and came back to the King with the recommendation that equity should have precedence over common law. Now, the reason he said this, and the reasoning that Francis gives in his judgment, and it's exactly the same reasoning that Portia gives here, is as follows. It's because mercy is an attribute of God. Mercy is a divine attribute. And the king, or the queen, is acting in the sense of God's representative on earth, or certainly God's representative within society. This is very much the Shakespearean idea, and it's very much the Baconian idea. So that mercy comes down from above, from God, and the king then continues that mercy coming down. So with Portia, we had, it drops as the gentle rain from heaven, coming down. It's like this divine balm, that word will come up in a sec, but this divine healing liquid, or nourishing liquid even. It's been referred to as manna by some commentators who have looked at Portia's speech. So we have, in the middle of the 1590s, we have Francis Bacon involved in this whole issue of equity versus common law, and now we have the play of Merchant of Venice displaying this interest in the common law. And then when Francis comes along in 1616 and gives the legal determination which sorts out this major issue, he actually is so bold as to cite Portia's speech from the Merchant of Venice. Now, can it really be the case? Was Francis really thinking these thoughts in the 1590s when he was working on this play? Well, amazingly, we have this a document that Francis wrote in 1592, and it's a letter of advice to Queen Elizabeth that Francis wrote. Now, just think about that for a moment. A 32-year-old lawyer, trainee lawyer, addressing himself to the Queen with a letter of advice. Now, imagine today, how far would you get with that today? So Francis had some special reason or some special sense that he was entitled to do that. So he writes this very fascinating document to Queen Elizabeth in 1592 with his advice to her on a lot of different topics. And on one particular section, he takes a whole page to talk about clemency, the topic of clemency. Now, mercy, equity, clemency, these concepts are all very nearly the same. They actually, you can hair-split them and divide them. There's some nuance to the differences. But broadly speaking, mercy, equity, clemency, we're talking about the same thing. And here's what Francis says to the Queen. And he's talking about here the fact that she's very just and she dispenses justice. And then she says, "Yet, when it is a question of drawing the sword, there is ever a conflict between the justice of her place, joined with the necessity of her state, and her royal clemency, which as a sovereign and precious balm continually distilleth from her fair hands, and falleth into the wounds of many that have incurred the offence of her law." What an extraordinary quotation that is. So he's liking clemency or mercy or equity to a balm, B-A-L-M, that's dripping down from her hands, actually being distilled from her royal hands and dropping down, a healing liquid dropping down literally into the wounds of those who need relief below. Now this word relief is specifically what equity is all about. Equity is about bringing relief. The common law deals with property. Equity deals with the person, and it brings relief to the person who is suffering from the harshness of the law, the judgment of the law. So here we have Francis Bacon in 1592 addressing the Queen and talking about her royal clemency coming from God as balm dropping down. Then in 1596 we have Portia talking about mercy being the attribute of kings, the throned monarch, like rain gently dropping down. And now we have in 1616 Francis actually solving the problem of common law versus equity, and in his actual opinion citing Portia's speech as part of his legal thinking in this. Now in fact he wasn't the only one. Lord Ellesmere, who was also the great champion of equity in those times, he also, if you can believe this, quotes the Merchant of Venice at that time as part of this discussion. He's talking about equity and he says, if equity, and I paraphrase, if equity is not to be given precedence over the common law, then, he says to the king, you will end up just being like the Duke of Venice. Now the Duke of Venice is the character in the play here who represents the equity side in the trial scene, but yet under the laws of Venice he didn't have quite the power that the king has here. So he was able to dispense equity, the Duke of Venice, but he didn't have the power to really enforce it. So here's Lord Ellesmere referring to the Duke of Venice not having the power. There's nothing else he could be referring to there except the play. So we have both Lord Ellesmere and Francis Bacon, it seems, referring to the play, which is really quite extraordinary. So now I want to pivot back to the book of Sir Thomas More, which I brought up at the beginning. And there's some very amazing parallels between the book of Sir Thomas More and the Merchant of Venice. First of all, they both come out at the same time. The book of Sir Thomas More is being written 1593, 4, 5, around that time. Merchant of Venice is probably 1596, 97. The Sir Thomas More is a collaboration of sorts between this Anthony Mundi and Shakespeare. And we'll see Anthony Mundi plays a role in the Merchant of Venice in a moment. But there are 3 or 4 phrases that turn up in the Sir Thomas More, which also turn up in Merchant of Venice and nowhere else. This phrase, on the hip, is one, which turns up here and turns up in Merchant of Venice. But more broadly, the interesting connection here is that Sir Thomas More play is dealing with this encounter between the local Londoners and the foreigners, and what happens when cultures clash. The same thing is happening in Merchant of Venice, but everything is settled down. Now the thing about Sir Thomas More is it was too hot to handle. The play was not licensed for performance because it was too controversial, because in the 1590s there were riots in the streets of London yet again about foreigners. The play was considered too incendiary. So it's almost as if Merchant of Venice is a second attempt at Sir Thomas More, kind of cooling it down, dealing with the same issues but trying to bring them below the surface. But in particular in Sir Thomas More there's a particular reference where it actually refers to the king's clemency, the majesty, the clemency of the majesty. So that the way that the speech goes, Sir Thomas More says, imagine what would happen to you if if you did end up killing perhaps one of these refugees, and the king then banished you, in his clemency he banished you to another country, well then you would be a stranger in another land, you would be treated as a stranger, and you wouldn't like that. And when that and so there's the very word in Sir Thomas More, clemency, from the king, coming up again in the same context. And the context is the context of degree in society, harmony in society. And this is an idea of Bacon's, and it's an idea of Shakespeare's, that is exhibited both in this Sir Thomas More and elsewhere in Shakespeare's plays. That if society, if everyone's in their right place, if everyone is in their degree, the common people, the nobility, up to the king, and then at the top, God, if everyone stays in their place, then we have harmony. And there's a long speech in Coriolanus, there's a long speech in Troilus and Cressida by Ulysses, where these ideas are put forward. But, says Shakespeare, when these things fall apart, what happens is that men fall on each other, and men attack each other, and men start to eat each other up. Men start to eat each other up. And this is literally the exact phrase that is used. Yeah. Here we are. Here is Sir Thomas More. You had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how order should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man, for other ruffians as their fancies wrought, with self-same hand, self-reasons and self-right, would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes would feed on one another. So there's the image of men feeding on one another. And the exact same line, would feed on one another, occurs in Coriolanus. You cry against the noble senate, who under the gods keep you in awe, which else would feed on one another. The only two times in Elizabethan writing where that line occurs. Once in Sir Thomas More, once in Coriolanus. And now here's Bacon from the Advancement of Learning. When once the court goes to the side of injustice, the law becomes a public robber, and one man's simply a wolf to another. There we are, the same idea. Bacon, Shakespeare, Sir Thomas More. And the idea is this, that when society works and everyone is in their right place, when mercy is coming down from above like a healing liquid, then we have order. But when that breaks down, then men turn on each other and eat each other up like animals, like wolves, like fish, like pigs. So, just standing back and looking at that for a moment, we see now these two ideas which Shakespeare and Bacon both return to over and over again, brought together beautifully in Merchant of Venice. We have, if equity prevails, if mercy prevails here, if Shylock will forgive what's happening, then order will prevail. But if that doesn't happen, we're going to be falling on each other, and there is these fears of eating each other up, these fears of mutual incorporation, these fears of being cruel to each other, which is another usury. This is another, when Francis Bacon has his essay on usury, he says, the tooth of usury be not grinded too much. In other words, that usury, loaning money on interest, is like eating each other up, like men eating each other up. And in fact, the very word usury comes from the same word as to eat or to bite in Hebrew. It's the same word. So we have this long-running set of ideas that usury and social breakdown are likened to us, the fear of eating each other up, and that the antidote that is, if you like, is the mercy of God coming down from the King. All right, so really, Sir Thomas More and the Merchant of Venice have a very, very interesting relationship to each other. Both refer to Shakespeare, both refer to Bacon, both seem to be dealing with this issue of the encounter between the local and the other, and they're also both dealing with this issue of equity. But remember I said that we have, well, I haven't got to the sources yet. I want to talk about the sources. So, where do these ideas of equity come from? Are they inherent in the sources that Shakespeare used for the play, or have they been inserted by the author themselves? Well, the thing about Merchant of Venice is it very highly follows its sources that it's based on. And the way that it differs from the sources is very fascinating. And this story is very interesting. Now, I talk a lot more about this in my previous talk that I've given on Merchant of Venice, which you can see on YouTube. I'm not going to go over the details here, but in this I'm pretty much just going to cite my results. And this might sound rather extraordinary, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. The Merchant of Venice is definitely based on this book, Il Pecorone, which was written in Italian and was published in the 1550s, was never published in English. So it's a big mystery to the Orthodox how Shakespeare got a hold of this book, because the plot follows this very, very closely. It also, now this book appeared in 1581 in Paris, and this is really the key to the whole thing. It's a book called The Epitomes, and it's 100 examples of oratory, 100 short speeches, and it's written by someone called Alexandre Sylvain, which is a pseudonym. Alexandre Sylvain, well, think about that word for a second. Alexander means conqueror, and Sylvain means nature. So Alexandre Sylvain is the conqueror of nature, which is a very interesting phrase if you think about that in relation to Francis Bacon. But this appeared in 1581. It's 100 speeches, and the 95th is the speech of the Jew and the Christian responding to each other in the sense of the pound of flesh, taken from Il Pecorone. So, here. Somebody in 1580 in Paris read in Italian Il Pecorone and really liked this particular story about the pound of flesh. They found the pound of flesh story there. It does occur in other places as well, but this is the version of it that occurs in Merchant of Venice. Somebody read this in Italian in 1580 in Paris. That person then imagined two speeches from the trial scene, the Jew and the Christian, and he put them in this book in French in 1581. Now, in 1596, that book gets translated into English. It's called The Orator, and it's translated by someone called Lazarus Pio. Now, that is a pseudonym. There's no such person as Lazarus Pio. Lazarus Pio is Anthony Mundi. Anthony Mundi. So in 1596, Anthony Mundi translates the 1581 book into English, including the two speeches, the speech of the Jew and the speech of the Christian, and these speeches then feed into the Merchant of Venice play. It's absolutely clear that the Merchant of Venice, the author of the Merchant of Venice, has read this book and has used these speeches in the play. Now, for the Orthodox, they can't make anything of any of that. They can't explain how Shakespeare read Italian. They can't understand how it got into this book. They think that the play couldn't have been written before Shakespeare read this book, because this was his first exposure to the story of the pound of flesh, and they can't understand how all the legal details got into it. So, here's what happened, and I'm just going to state the result, and for those who want to see this proved, please watch my earlier talk. It was Francis Bacon himself who read Il Pecorone in 1581. He visited Italy, and let it be said that Francis Bacon in 1581 definitely visited Italy and France and Spain. That is, people think that's not true. It's absolutely true, and it's Smedley's book, The Mystery of Francis Bacon. He proves it voluminously and dots the I's and crosses the T's. So Francis Bacon read Il Pecorone, and he read the story of the pound of flesh. And he realised, you know what, this is a really interesting story, and it's about the Jew and the Christian, and you know what, he said, if I wrote it about myself and my brother, we would be Bacon brothers, the pound of flesh would be the pound of bacon. That would make a really funny comedy. And remember, The Merchant of Venice is a comedy. Now this is very, very interesting, because if you think now about Sir Thomas More, we already know that Sir Thomas More is a collaboration between Anthony Mundi and William Shakespeare / Francis Bacon. And now we have Anthony Mundi translating this work and it being used by Shakespeare the very next year for The Merchant of Venice. So clearly there's something going on here behind the scenes between Anthony Mundi and William Shakespeare / Francis Bacon. Now, the question is, to what extent now does equity considerations enter into these sources? This is why I've taken you down this long path to get to this question. Is the question of equity in Merchant of Venice something that Francis Bacon introduced into the play, or did he get it from these sources? Well, amazingly, he got it from the sources. If we go back to Il Pecorone in the original Italian, and let me read. But the Jew, he next turned to the Jew, and I'm reading the English translation now from Il Pecorone, the Italian. He turned to the Jew and said he was ready to pay the money that was due and as much more as he cared to demand. But the Jew made answer that he wanted not the money since it had not been paid in due time, but he desired to cut his pound of flesh from Ansaldo. Over this matter there arose great debate and everyone condemned the Jew. But seeing that equitable law ruled in Venice and the Jew's contract was fully set forth and in customary legal form, no one could deny him his rights. All they could do was entreat his mercy. There it is. Right back in the original Italian version in 1550, they're talking about this as being an example of equity law, as equity considerations were coming into it. So Francis Bacon grew up, of course, in the house of the Lord Chancellor. That was his father, Sir Nicholas Bacon. He grew up, and the Chancery is equity law. So Francis Bacon grew up soaked in the atmosphere of equity law, as it were. So when he encountered this story at the age of 21, when he realised what a powerful story it was, when he realised how even more powerful it would be if the characters were secretly called Bacon, and he realised that it also gave the opportunity to explore the whole issue of equity versus common law because it's actually there in the original. But wait, you say it's in the original, but what about in the epitomes, in the Orator? Does it get carried through? Does it get carried through or not? Are we just making all this up? Or can we really find this thread of equity running all the way through? And here we are now. Here we are. This is the 95th declaration from the Orator. This is the Christian now responding to the Jew. And this is his first words. It is no strange matter to hear those dispute of equity which are themselves most unjust. That's the very first line out of the Antonio character in the oratory. There's something more going on. So he's referring to the fact that this is a dispute of equity. He's using the very word, but he's also saying, now equity it tends to be characterised, or has been characterised by what they call maxims of equity. So these books are almost like proverbs. So the equity law is sort of characterised by these maxims. And one of the main ones is, he who would have equity must do equity. This is one of the leading equity maxims. And there it is. Let me read that line again. It is no strange matter to hear those dispute of equity which are themselves most unjust. There's Anthony in the Orator actually saying to the Jew, you want equity, but you won't do equity. And look, that violates the first maxim of equity. So I asked at the beginning, is it possible? Is it really possible, as Mark Edwin Andrews suggested, that Francis Bacon was really quoting from Portia, from the play, in this dispute about equity? And now we've gone back and we've looked at the sources of Merchant of Venice, and we've shown that this concern with equity tracks all the way through in the actual sources of the play. So yes, the issue of equity is woven into the very warp and weft of this play. Now just very briefly, this is a sort of a quirky little thing, but when Portia says tarry a little, there is something else. And this is the start of this second half of the trial, where it's an equity court. This bond does give thee here no jot of blood. The words expressly are a pound of flesh. This tarry a little, it's a very interesting phrase. It sounds like there's nothing to it. Tarry a little, what does it mean? It means wait a moment, doesn't it? Wait a moment. Now again, there's a really fascinating phrase in relation to Francis Bacon, because there's a proverb or a saying that Francis Bacon says many times, and here it is in one of his essays. I knew a wise man that had it for a byword, when he saw men hasten to a conclusion, stay a little, that we may make an end the sooner. In other words, let's wait and spend some more time doing this now, and that will make the whole enterprise work out shorter than if we just stop now and go away. Now he mentions this over and over in his essays, and this is exactly the thought that is there in Portia. Tarry a little. Now I wouldn't want to make too much of this. I wouldn't prove anything of it, but if you want to be poetically tuned into this, tarry a little and stay a little are exactly the same. Now, funnily enough, this same anecdote gets repeated after Bacon dies in Rawleigh's Remains, which is a whole collection of items from Bacon's life. Here it is here. I knew a wise man that had it for a byword when he saw men hasten to a conclusion, stay a little, that we may make an end the sooner. But look at the one beforehand. My Lord Chancellor Ellesmere, when he'd read a petition which he disliked, would say, what, you'd have my hand to this now? And the party answering yes, he would say further, well, so you shall have both my hands to it, and he would, with both his hands, tear it to pieces. Now, what's going on here? Lord Ellesmere, this is the Chancellor, this is the Lord Chancellor, this is the equity guy, and this is a bond in the equity court, and this is exactly what they would do with a bond when a bond was deemed to be no longer valid or wanted to be made invalid. Literally tearing it in half was the correct way to deal with the bond. And in fact, if you go back to El Pecorone, that's the way the trial scene actually ends, with the Jew tearing his bond in half. So I don't know if Rawley here was having a little joke, dropping this little hint to Merchant of Venice here, right next to a reference to Lord Ellesmere and tearing up a bond. Probably not, but I like to think it's a quirky little thing. All right, so let's go back to Sir Thomas More. Really, everything that I've said today stands or falls on whether the handwriting of the Sir Thomas More 3 pages of Shakespeare is the same as Bacon's handwriting. It's as simple as that, isn't it? We have 3 pages of Shakespeare. Now, of course, they've gone to town trying to match that 3 pages of Shakespeare's handwriting to the 6 shaky signatures of William of Stratford, and they write long, boring essays that come to no conclusion whatsoever. Well, we don't need to be experts in graphology or handwriting this afternoon to at least make a preliminary judgment or decree on this issue. On the left is the page from Sir Thomas More. On the right is a sample of Francis Bacon's handwriting. And you can see from a glance, from across the room, it's the same handwriting. Now, has anyone noticed this before? Yes. Yes, someone has noticed it before. Here's an incredible pamphlet. Manuscript said to be the handwriting of William Shakespeare, identified as the penmanship of another person. Mystery of Sir Thomas More document unveiled. An entirely new phrase of the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy by Edwin J. Desmoigneau, Los Angeles, California, 1924. There it is. It's so rare. I tracked this down once at this ridiculous bookshop in upstate New York, and I paid a ridiculous amount of money for it. And here it was in 1924, this extraordinary book where this chap, Edwin Desmoigneau, several decades now after the Sir Thomas More manuscript has been discovered, decided to sit down and see if it actually compared with Francis Bacon's handwriting. And his conclusion is that yes, it does. And this is from the pamphlet. On the left, you can see with the half dots, this is all from the Sir Thomas More manuscript. Without the half dots is examples from Francis Bacon's own writings. And he's gone through and collected examples of all the different letters and all the different words and shown that whoever wrote the Sir Thomas More 3 pages had the same handwriting as Francis Bacon. There he's done it again with the individual letters, individual words. And no one seems to have really done anything more with that ever since, anything more with that in nearly 100 years. But there it is, tying the whole thing very, very neatly together. Now, nearly done. I just want to finish off with just touching base with 2 other of the sources to Merchant of Venice, just to squeeze a little bit more out of this. One of the sources that influences the Merchant of Venice is The Jew of Malta, the play by Marlowe, which was very popular, 1591, 1592. Scholars agree for certain the Merchant of Venice is influenced by The Jew of Malta. There are some quotes that turn up into it. But The Jew of Malta is a very different play, and again, it's the Jew versus the Christians. The Jewish character in this case, Barabbas, is a very different character from Shylock and doesn't have necessarily some of those sympathetic or human elements to Shylock, which kind of soften Shylock. Barabbas is a bit more of the bloodthirsty Jew, perhaps no less theatrically interesting, but quite different. But let me review, if I may, the ending of The Jew of Malta. Now, I'm sure all of you would be very familiar with the ending of The Jew of Malta, so you just need a reminder of how that play, actually, I'm just joking, who remembers the ending of the 5th act of The Jew of Malta? Here's what happens in the 5th act of The Jew of Malta. Barabbas, the Jew, has invited the Christians to come to dinner, to dine with him at his castle. But he set up a trap. He set up a trap door with a trip, and when the Christians are going to come up into the castle, the trap door is going to swing open, and the Christians are going to plunge down into a cauldron which has been prepared, which has seasoning and wine, a big cooking pot, and the Christians are going to fall into the cooking pot. So he's invited them to dinner, but he's actually inviting them to be eaten. Well, in a hilarious tragicomic end to the story, he's showing, Barabbas is showing how the trapdoor works to someone else, and he accidentally gets caught in his own trap, plunges through his own trapdoor and ends up being boiled alive in his own cooking pot, so the tables are turned. So rather extraordinarily, we have exactly the same plot machinery underlaying the Jew of Malta in terms of the interaction between the Jews and the Christians is being resolved by this same set of ideas, this idea of eating, this idea of coming together to eat as being a site of anxiety, and this idea of literally consuming each other, for the foreigner being consumed by the local, for the local being consumed by the other. Now we're nearly done. There's just one final one that I'd like to share with you. This is a very, very odd source of Merchant of Venice. It's called Janus the Jew, and it's a poem which appeared around the time. Now, there's no evidence that the poem appeared before the play, none at all. The earliest appearance of this poem is after the play. But nevertheless, there's a lot of debate as to whether it was before or after. Certainly, it seems to be based on the play. But I'm just going to read out to you. Now, it's a kind of a funny thing because it's like almost a bawdy bit of doggerel. It's a song. This is not high literary. This is like a street song. But as you can see, it concerns the same plot, the Jew, the pound of flesh. I just want to read to you the first 3 verses. Here we go. Janus the Jew. In Venice town not long ago, a cruel Jew did dwell, which lived all on usury, as Italian writers tell, il pecorone. Janus called was the Jew, which never thought to die, nor ever yet did any good to them in streets that lie. His life was like a barrow hog, that liveth many a day, yet never once do any good until men will him slay. Or, like a filthy heap of dung that lieth in a hoard, which never can do any good till it be spread abroad. All right, so, now this isn't politically correct. This is a little bit dodgy, all this stuff, but nevertheless, here we have the Jew being spoken of as if he's a barrow hog, which is a pig. Now, that's obviously a highly sort of controversial thing to say, but what a funny thing to do to bring in the notion of a pig right into the beginning of this poem, which is clearly a riff on the Merchant of Venice. But then the second one, or like a filthy heap of dung that lieth in a hoard, which never can do any good till it be spread abroad. Now, the Baconians in the audience are all nodding because that's recognised. That's one of Francis's most famous sayings, that riches or money are no good. They are like dung. They're no good when they're heaped up. They're only good when it's spread around. Now, this is a characteristic phrase of Francis. It absolutely is associated with him, that he used over and over again. I think it actually derives from the Inn of Court where he lived. But there it is, the characteristic Francis Bacon phrase introduced in the first couple of paragraphs here, and this reference to a pig. Now, I have no idea what's going on with this poem, but it seems to me that perhaps someone's got a whiff of what's really going on behind the scenes with Merchant of Venice and has written this piece of doggerel based on that. Be that as it may, I think it's time to wrap it all up now. So, The Merchant of Venice as a play, to me, it has infinite depths, and the more I think about it, the more it unpacks. And it seems to reflect many, many fascinating elements of both Francis Bacon's personal life at the time, his legal life at the time, and his thinking at the time. I'm sure Anthony Bacon was involved, and in fact, that's a perfect way to end this. Of course, Anthony Bacon was living back in London at that time with near Francis, certainly with him at the start. Now, I must stress that Mark Edwin Andrews, in his book, is absolutely orthodox in terms of the authorship position. He goes out of his way, in fact, to say, I don't want this book to provide any help for the Baconians, even while he's talking about Bacon. But gee, he would have had a lot more fun if he'd realised that Francis was involved. For example, and this has got to be my favourite part of the whole book, and I'll end with this. Well, I quote from page 33. In his memoirs of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, Birch gives an inkling of the intensity of this struggle between law and equity. For Anthony Bacon, brother of Francis Bacon, writing in 1596 to a friend in Venice, says, "Into whose place, with extraordinary speed, Her Majesty hath advanced Sir Thomas Egerton, Lord Ellesmere, with general applause of both court, city and county for the reputation he hath of integrity, law, knowledge and courage. So what's happening there? Anthony Bacon is writing a letter to a friend saying that Lord Ellesmere has been raised to the position of Lord Chancellor to the Equity Courts, that's a very good thing, that everyone's very happy about that. And this is Anthony Bacon writing the letter to a friend in Venice in 1596, literally while the Merchant of Venice play is being written by Francis, possibly with a little bit of help by Anthony, possibly with a little bit of help from Anthony Mundi. At that time, Venice, Equity, 1596, Anthony Bacon, there it is. Thank you very much.